The future of tariffs is uncertain, but one thing is clear: Boyd and Kevin can help you mitigate your risk. Preview of their talk at the RVCF conference with important insights for you on tariffs uncertainty and risk mitigation. Next on the Savvy Supplier. Welcome into the Savvy Supplier, where we save you time and money. I'm Al Frank. Boyd Evert, the CEO of HRG, is here, and so is Kevin Stewart, partner at Crowe LLP. Gentlemen, the U.S. Supreme Court hearing on tariffs will come the very next day after you both give a talk together at the RVCF conference in Scottsdale, Arizona. You couldn't have picked a more timely topic. You both are teaming up to give a talk on tariffs and uncertainty, strategies for mitigating risk. Would you give us a little sneak peek about what you'll be sharing there?
So I think the three major areas of concern that we have around this is just how tariffs are impacting pricing, that no one's going to absorb this unilaterally, that there's going to be a shared burden. So what does that look like? Then also, how does this affect levels of inventory and how people are trying to mitigate risk, maybe buying ahead of certain tariffs going into effect and managing those potential concerns? And then finally, what do you do if your customer is sitting on a lot of inventory that you've pushed in, maybe in full alignment with merchandising, that you both have these expectations, but then there's so much volatility around demand right now and uncertainty that forecasts just aren't as useful as they have been in previous years. So those are the three major areas: pricing, inventory levels, and then markdowns and clearance, and how do you manage funding those?
So as you were researching for this talk, did you find examples of some retail suppliers who might be facing inordinately large impacts from tariffs?
Yeah, some of those examples came to me because we have clients that were experiencing this firsthand. And I think the first analogy I went to was in 2018, there was a very large uptick in demand for certain parts that were used in the manufacture of TVs as well as electric vehicles. And normally in the consumer electronics category, you have the price point that you launch at for a particular TV. Then over the following months, you have a series of price declines where you're purchasing the level of inventory, the cost of inventory down with price protection. So you're buying that inventory down till you get to the clearance level and then it's out. But this anomaly that impacted not only our clients, but everyone in that category, you saw a spike in the price of TVs. So TVs stopped going down and they surged upward. Some cases, they were higher than the initial launch of those models. And that is something that is just, I've never seen in my career in retailing. And so what happens there is the particular exposure there is that every retailer has language around implementing cost increases and price increases. And usually you have to give them a 60-day notice. And so we were working feverishly with our clients to help draft letters notifying the retailers that we need you to waive this because these are costs that are happening in real time and there's no way we can absorb this. We have to pass on a price increase. We just don't want to get penalized for it. And the retailers aligned to that. But the ones that didn't, when the auditors came along, they looked at that and they said, you failed to give us a 60-day notice, and they wrote claims. I know that's a mouthful, but that's just the first example. There's others, but COVID has some fallout with the inventory levels. But I think that was a really an education to go back through and look at it through the lens of tariffs. And I saw a lot of areas of alignment with the concerns that our clients have today.
So, Boyd, kind of related, there was, when whether it be a sales opportunity or whether it be something else, if there's a significant increase in inventory costing and there becomes a blending of inventory, like the overlap of that, what are some recommendations by which clients, vendors, whoever can kind of protect themselves to put a line in the sand? This is the inventory costing before, and this is the inventory costing after, and kind of along with that. So what are your thoughts or recommendations on that?
Right. Great question. So a lot of retailers recently have pushed back on average cost of inventory, right? So that just because you can play games with how do you measure that average beyond FIFO and LIFO. There's other concerns about, how you're costing that inventory. So I would say first is to have that conversation of alignment. And that's important because a lot of times if you try to do that conversation via email and you have a bad actor in audit, they can come and pull that email out of context and make it sound like you're saying something you don't. So I'd say first have that verbal conversation about how do we want to manage these shifting costs, and then align to, in an email, this is where we're landing on that and having that conversation. And I think in this case too, is that average cost, we're talking usually in the industry where you're going from an old cost to a new cost. Well, in this situation that we've seen over the last several months, you could be dealing with 2 or 3 costs. And we've seen that before in the industry where there's some volatility and there's 2 or 3 costs in that average inventory. Well, then you're going to have to call that out as well, as how are we going to track this, and what's the impact on retail? Because if you don't have that conversation, then you're going to end up having a margin audit where they're going to come back and say, well, this ate into our margin. We weren't getting the same margin when we moved from the old cost to the new cost, the old retail to the new retail. So in an age where everything's being pushed to portals, I'm encouraging everyone to try to have that conversation with a human being and try to get some sort of alignment. Short of that, you're going to have a series of ongoing concerns unless you have those conversations.
So someone coming from the accounting and finance world, like I do, when there's times of volatility, in my mind, there has to be, I think I've referred to a playbook frequently, but there also has to be a circling of the wagon. So who is that team kind of coming together, and beyond the accounting and finance team of the CFO, controller, tax, and you also have procurement, sales, and FP&A. To me, it's critically important that team stay on the same play sheet. Like they're thinking in the same way, they're operating in the same way. Maybe the frequency of those meetings that they're having is a little bit more frequent when there's moments of significant volatility, which is kind of happening now. I'm assuming you've seen moments where maybe those teams have not necessarily been on the same page, and an innocent email or innocent communication has kind of created a lot of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. Teams need to keep their alignment, maintain that level of alignment with sales, finance, credit collections. They all need to understand, well, what are our major objectives? How do we get alignment? How do we stick to that playbook, as you refer to it? Then you have to understand, what are we going to communicate to our customers, and how are we going to do that in a uniform way? We have some clients where they're extremely organized. We have a couple of clients that are like best in class, where there's a letter that goes out 90 days in advance of any major price increases. All the teams are told, here's how we're moving forward. And those are wonderful to work with, those sorts of alignment. I was going to suggest that most teams aren't that well organized, and you have to understand there's competing demands, competing concerns. The things that concern a sales team are going to not be top of mind for finance or credit collections or supply chain, right? Sometimes I share with our client teams that sales throws a party and finance and credit collections have to clean up after them, right? So they make all these wild promises sometimes, and then they have to figure out how are we going to execute on that. So you've got that concern, but then you also have on the retailer side, they've got their own playbook, right? And they're looking at it from a different perspective. And they're looking at, yes, we're going to sell at this retail, and you're going to sell it to this cost, but we're expecting this margin, and we expect you to help us get that margin, right? It's not up to us to maintain a higher retail so we get that margin. They're going to push that back. So I think that's probably going to be where a lot of the friction that we're seeing now, and we're going to continue to see, is how do retailers get the margin they're looking for without constantly pushing back on the supplier, forcing them. In some cases, suppliers are just going to stop shipments or threaten to stop shipping unless those deductions against those prices that they're not aligned to pay.
So for each of you, what are some key takeaways that you hope conference attendees will take with them from your talk?
I would say, even though there's volatility, there's still things that you can control, and that's what you focus on. And so when I think through it, we've talked about partnership here. You can call that governance, rapid response. Have your team in place. How are we addressing this significant volatility? And then it's looking at, those contract and consumer, that management, that customer management. How are we communicating? How are we indexing our pricing? How are we kind of tracking the deviations in these variables that may be happening, whether that be in the cost of the material to produce something, or whether it be just the tariffs themselves? And then it's thinking through, what are those tactical levers that you can actually do and control? Are there levers you can pull? How do you accrue? How do you maintain or track the price concessions, making sure that you're revenue is recognized properly and the inventory is recorded properly and kind of your margins are accurate. And then lastly, it's around systems. So do you have the right systems in place? Is that an Excel spreadsheet? God forbid. Is that something else that you're using? But really in working through these times of significant volatility, there is security in knowing what steps you're going to take. And there's security in taking the actions that you can take and just knowing. And I think what Boyd is bringing to the picture, he can share, but he kind of gets in the nuts and bolts of it. Here's the things we're seeing, and here's how we can specifically do. But from my perspective, it's what are those things you control, and what do you have? What can you manage and do on your own? And to me, there's security in that.
I think we're going to give them some examples that they can use to understand those particular points that Kevin just outlined. It's always easier to work with concrete examples versus hypotheticals, right? And so as we talk through these best practices, we're going to be able to point to certain events that have happened over the past 8 to 10 years that in those conversations where you might not have the alignment you'd like, you could say, well, here's a scenario that's similar to what we're experiencing or we're trying to address. And look how this particular scenario went south, right? It went off the rails. It resulted in a mess. So you can use some of these examples to help drive those changes, that discipline, right, Kevin? Because you can have a great plan, but once you leave that huddle and everyone's going to do what they want to do, right? Then it's execution so important, right?
Yeah, I think wasn't it Mike Tyson that says that, everybody's ready until they're punched in the face, right? And so what do you do then? But I think your point is right. We have history that we can look at. We can say, and even in my life, it's looking back after an event, after a close, after a transaction, and saying, what could we have done differently? What should we have done differently? What were the symptoms that we missed? And so if your eyes are more wide open to what's going on, it does allow for better decision making.
Well, it sounds like a great talk. I know you've been working really hard on it. And the good news is there's still time to register for anyone who wants to attend the conference. You can register by going to the link on the screen below for the RVCF conference in Scottsdale, Arizona. That's November 2nd through the 5th. Boyd and Kevin are looking forward to meeting you there. Well, also, we want to thank you for subscribing to our podcast. We have more than 2,000 subscribers now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it's totally free. Just click subscribe, and that will help more people to find the podcast. Very thankful for you subscribers for helping us to grow it. And as always, our wish for you is this: wiser decisions, fewer deductions. See you next time on the Savvy Supplier.